Hello and welcome to this series of webinars by the Marketing and Communication Center of the Conference Board. I'm Chiqui Cartagena, the CMO of the Conference Board. Today we're going to explore how the delays of the 2020 U.S. Census may affect marketers next year. And to do that, I'm pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts. It's my pleasure to welcome Devera Cohn, a senior writer and editor at the Pew Research Center, where she studies and writes about demographics in the United States, especially the census. Devera was a Washington Post reporter for 21 years, mainly writing about demographics, and was the newspaper's lead reporter for the 2000 census. Also with us today, my good friend Mark Hugo Lopez, who is the Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center as well, where he leads the planning of the Center Research agenda on international demographic trends, international migration, U.S. immigration trends, and the U.S. Latino community. Mark was previously the Center's Director of Hispanic Research, which is why I know him so well. And of course, finally, our good friend, Dr. Jake Benefla, the Executive Director of the Center for Multicultural Science and a Senior Fellow here at the Conference Board. Welcome, everybody. And thank you all. Sure.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in to hear our discussion. Just a reminder that CTE credit is available for this webcast. If you would like to earn the credit, make sure to provide us with your name and email in the designated box below and click on the 3 pop-ups that will appear on the screen throughout the program. We're looking forward to an informative discussion over the course of the next hour about the decennial census and its implications for the economy and especially for marketers. But first, let me test your knowledge, audience, of the census. Please bring up the first census question. Okay, so here it is. What is the goal of the census? Is it to count everybody living in the U.S. once and only once in the right place, including foreign citizens who are not tourists or business visitors? Is it to determine if someone is in the country illegally? Or is it to determine the race, religion, and citizenship status of people living in the United States? So let's get you all voting on this, and we'll let it roll for a little bit. I know, Mark, you guys asked this question at the beginning of the year, and it'll be curious to see how our audience compares to your results. Can you tell us a little bit? There is confusion, right, about what is the goal of the census?
Yes, we find that some Americans are not necessarily knowledgeable of the purpose of the census or why the census is done. So it's interesting to see how the public sees this, and it'll be interesting to see how our audience answers.
And where do you think the confusion stems from? Is it that the media doesn't really sort of accurately tell people? I mean, this happens every 10 years. You'd think people know by now.
Well, it happens every 10 years, so that's a long period of time between each one of the censuses. This is one of the things that is asked of everybody in the country to do, like paying your taxes. This is one of those things where everybody is asked to participate. I'm going to not say any more because I don't want to influence the answers to the question. But it's something that, some people, they're not necessarily following this like you and I follow this. And so for some folks, this is oftentimes oh, I have to do that? Oh, I didn't know we were having a census. And it's also just very interesting to talk to people around the country about how aware they are of even the census coming.
I don't think we have fooled anybody with this first question. Let's see if we can broadcast the results. It looks like 100% of you got it right. The goal of the census is to count everybody living in the U.S. once and only once in the right place. Okay, let's go on to the second poll question that we have here. And it is very simple. Does the law require you to fill out and submit the U.S. Census form, or are you not required to fill it out and submit it? Again, I know this is one of the questions you were asking as well, and I see are people participating Nicholas Winfrey, you have a question in there. I will get to it as soon as I possibly can. Let me just get through this next poll question. And let's go ahead and close the poll so that we can publish the results. And the good news is, Mark, you did not give too much away. So
the census is required by law.
right.
You are required by law to fill out the census.
What happens to you? We'll see. But let's move on from the poll questions. And I just want to, our timing could not be better because COVID-19, of course, is having a big impact on the U.S. Census. And as a result, the Census Bureau has extended its schedule. Census workers normally would be done knocking on doors by now. But this year, they're just getting started. And there may be, and Vera is going to tell us a lot more, or may not, a delay in when the first census numbers are released. What does this mean, guys? What does this mean that there might be a delay? Vera.
Well, there are legal deadlines at this point for the Census Bureau to submit the data. And if they don't, they violate it. At first, they were asking for an extension, but now it appears that they've pulled back from releasing the numbers. However, the delay in operations has been a big challenge for them to round everybody's data up and get it done in time to release by the time the legal deadline requires them to do that.
Well, we're going to talk a lot more about this, but as a marketer, I often get asked why I'm so passionate about the multicultural community in the United States. And my answer is very simple. Demography is destiny. If you're in business in the United States and you're not focusing your marketing efforts on multicultural communities, you're missing out on perhaps the biggest growth opportunity you have in our own country. Just a few facts. For the past 2 decades, Hispanics have accounted for over 50%, half of the total U.S. population growth. And I have no doubt that this year's census will also, again, show how important the growth of the Latino population is for the future of the United States and its economy. Already today, the majority of people under the age of 18 are multicultural, meaning they're either Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, or that beautiful mix of all of them, which is also a fascinating topic that we'll get to maybe some other time. But listen up, marketers. By 2026, the majority of people in the United States between the ages of 18 and 24, one of our prime consumer target markets, will be multicultural. And just 2 years later, the sweet spot of marketers, 18 to 34-year-olds, the majority of them will be multicultural. And yet, only 5% of advertising budgets are dedicated to reaching multicultural consumers. But that's a conversation for another time. Today we're going to talk about what's happening with the census, and I have just one more poll question, and this one's tricky, so be aware of this one. What year did the census first start counting Hispanics in the United States? Your choices are 1970, 1990, or the year 2000. What year did the census start counting Hispanics, which of course are ethnicity, not a race, which we're going to get to in just a little second. I'm going to go ahead and let the poll run for another 30 seconds. Of course, Vera, historically the census started in the 1800s. What year was that?
1790 was the first census.
Oh my God! I got
carried
that.
out on horseback.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's certainly a conversation for another time. Let's close the poll and share the results. So this time I did get you. I got you. Because the first time the census started counting Latinos was in 1970. 1970. The first real count, of course, Mark, was in 1980, right? Tell us a little bit more about that.
That's correct. Yeah, so in 1970, the Census Bureau was able to put a question about are you Hispanic or not on some census forms. So it was not on the complete full census, but it was on a subset of the census. But that set the stage for 1980, which is when we had the Hispanic question on all census forms that were sent to all households in the U.S. that year. So 1980 is the first time we have a full representation.
Which is incredible.
We started counting
incredible.
in 1970.
And I believe the count, I might be wrong, but we were about 16 million in 1980. Was that 19?
Yeah, about 14 to 15 million in 1980, and then today we'll talk about this in a little bit.
Yeah.
We're almost
so the growth is
over 60 million now.
Astronomical. Please clarify for people who don't know, what is the difference between a race and an ethnicity, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so when we talk about race and ethnicity, first let's talk about race. We oftentimes, when you see the Census Bureau's question about race, most people think about race as, are you white, African American or black, Asian or Asian American, Native American or indigenous, mixed race, perhaps even some other race. If you'll notice, I didn't say Hispanic in that. So Hispanic has not been part of the race question that has been included on the census since the 1980s. However, we do have a separate question for Hispanic. Are you Hispanic or not? And oftentimes you'll see the census will have in parentheses a note saying that Hispanic is not a race. And in reports like those from the Pew Research Center, we'll oftentimes say Hispanics are of any race. And among Hispanics, race is also a set of characteristics that are important to the population. Some people call themselves Afro-Latino, for example. Some folks will identify with their indigenous roots. So Hispanic may be an ethnicity, but within it, there folks have a set of identifications around race.
And in my book, Latino Boom, I talk about how in 2010, 37% of Latinos actually marked that box that said, I'm some other race. So they really actually have a hard time sort of defining, right, where they belong from a racial perspective. But again, another subject for another time. I have one little surprise thing before we get into your presentation. I wanted to investigate why the census is important, and my director of digital media marketing said you should see this West Wing clip from 20 years ago talking about the importance of the census. Go ahead, let's roll this video.
Explain it to me.
The Constitution mandates that every 10 years we count everybody.
Why?
Because representation at the various levels of the government, federal, state, and municipal, is based on population. The only way to find out how many congressmen California gets is to count the people in California. Got it?
Can I just say that if the briefing book had been written that clearly, I would have easily understood.
We're not through yet.
Okay.
Well, that's just, it's right? It's simple, but it's not that simple. So to tell us more about what's happening right now with the census, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Devera, who have a series of slides. And please ask questions along the way. Jake and I will do the same, and we'll try to get your questions answered as soon as possible. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Chiki. Thank you for the great introduction. That video clip was really great. It was so clear, but also opens the door to all the questions and nuances that are associated with running something like the decennial census in the United States. I want to start by talking a little bit about who we are at Pew Research, because I think it's important to put that in perspective. The Pew Research Center is based in Washington. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. We're about providing information to the public. Dee and I do a lot of work around the demography of the United States, and we rely a lot on Census Bureau data. So the very question that we're going to be talking about today, about the importance of the census for marketers, this is something that we at the Research Center oftentimes think about ourselves, how important the quality of the data is, when it's coming out, what we'll be able to say with this data. We are oftentimes very, very closely following everything around the releases from the Census Bureau. We also do our own public opinion surveys. But I think one of the important things there, and I'm sure for many of our marketing colleagues this is important as well, is that what we learn from products from the census, like the American Community Survey, an annual survey that measures the characteristics of the country, or even the decennial census, those figures will play a role in shaping and weighting public opinion data to the demographics of the country. So we rely very much on the Census Bureau's data products, in addition to the U.S. Census, to get a sense of what the country is about. So with all that, let me move on to some important context for thinking about the upcoming results from the 2020 census. First, the nation's changing demographics. Chiki, you already talked about this some, but this is a slide that shows you what's happened since 2010. So 2010 to 2019, how has the U.S. population changed? Now, you might be asking yourself, wait, the census is probably going to count people and tell us this, but interestingly, the Census Bureau also produces annual population estimates along race and ethnicity and a few other dimensions, and I'm sharing with you here the results from the 2019 population estimates. You can see that Latinos, according to these estimates, have made up about half of the nation's population growth since 2010. Asians have accounted for about 22%, blacks about 17%, but notice for whites, and this is, by the way, is white non-Hispanics, this population has not grown over the last 10 years. It's basically stayed about the same. And that's, I think, an interesting point to keep in mind, that when we talk about the nation's changing demographics, growth is coming from particularly Hispanics and Asians, and whites are not growing as fast, if at all, compared to those other populations. Another thing I think to note here, though, is the size of the Hispanic population. It is now at 60.6 million people by the estimate of the U.S. Census Bureau. But again, these are population estimates. The 2020 census will give us an update of where the nation stands demographically. And so it's likely that the 60.6 million will be different, perhaps even different by a lot compared to what the census may measure. So that's why it's important to stay tuned to see what we might get from the U.S. Census itself. Also, to give you some sense of why these numbers are so important, we oftentimes think about, in the case of the Hispanic population, the nation's Hispanics, you oftentimes might think, oh, that's a population concentrated in just a few states, Illinois, New York, California, Texas, Florida. But the story of Hispanic population growth has really been one of dispersion around the country. And that has been one where you could really see where are the fastest growing Hispanic populations. Actually, it happens to be in the upper Midwest, in North Dakota and South Dakota. Now, admittedly, those are populations which are small to start with, and so it's easy to have a lot of growth. But you'll see here that there's many southern states that also have seen fast Hispanic population growth over the last 10 years. It's important to note that when we talk about the nation's racial and ethnic characteristics, it's not a story of just a few places, but it's actually a story of many places. And that dispersion of Hispanics, again, also with Asian Americans and Black Americans, really tells us a story of how diverse and multicultural the United States has become over the course of the last. Let me
ask a couple questions. We have a question from our audience.
Sure.
So you might want to go back one slide. Kimberly asked, why do you think there's been a decrease in white population?
There's been a slower population growth because of relatively fewer births or a lower birth rate. So the population hasn't had as many children as, say, the Hispanic and Asian population have had. Also, when we talk about one of the other big sources of growth, immigration has played a very important role for Hispanics and particularly for Asians. To give you a sense of this, about 2/3 of the Asian origin population in the United States is foreign-born or was born in another country. In the case of the white population, immigration hasn't been as important of a source of growth as it has been for, say, Hispanics and Asians. Those all together with an aging population has resulted in the white population just not growing as quickly as the younger Hispanic population and the more foreign-born Asian population.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You can go to the next slide. I saw a stat that said for every white person that's born in the United States, for every white person that dies in the United States, one white person is born. So it's pure replacement. Whereas for every Latino that dies, 8 are born. And contrary to the Asian, right, 80% of Latinos are now born in the United States. They're not foreign born. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. All great and important facts to keep in mind. And you hit it on the nose. Hispanic population growth, interestingly, while immigration is key, It's also not the biggest source. The actual bigger source of growth for Hispanics, at least since 2000, has been births in the United States. And so Hispanic births have played an important role for the U.S. Hispanic population's growth, but interestingly also for the U.S. population overall. And recently we've seen, though, that the fertility rate for Hispanic women has been dropping, and it's now looking more like other Americans. And I'm not sure if you've seen some recent news about how the U.S. population is not growing fast. It doesn't look like COVID is going to lead to a baby boom. All those things may have an implication for how fast the country grows into the future, including the Hispanic
All right, so now let's go to your next slide, because the disbursement of the Latino population has been going on, and it started really sort of in 2010. In 2000, you started noticing moving from those central areas, right, the Florida, New York, California, Texas, to the rest of the country. But what are my people doing in South Dakota?
So South Dakota and North Dakota have been a destination for many Americans, not just Hispanics. So there's been growth of population in those parts of the country because of the energy boom. This is particularly true of North Dakota. So energy in the last 10 years has been a driver of population growth in that part of the country. Hispanics have participated in that just like other Americans have. That's why we have those growth numbers.
New Hampshire and D.C.? That's interesting. New Hampshire especially, right? Because it used to be one of those very white states, and now it's not.
But its population has been growing some, and Hispanics have been part of that broad growth for the Northeast. But also, when you take a look at a place like D.C., D.C. has for a while now been a destination for many recent arrivals from Central America. So since the 1980s, there's been a growing Central American population in the D.C. area, and particularly in the District of Columbia. But D.C. also attracts a lot of different people, and its population change is reflecting some of the dynamics of the country because it has representation from everywhere.
Okay. Well, I'll let you keep on going.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over now to Dee, who's going to walk us through some of our survey results, but also some of the things that are happening around the census, timing, delays, et cetera. And so, Dee, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you'll control the PowerPoint presentation.
I will.
Correct?
Thank you. Thank you,
Mark. Before you go there, I just want to squeeze in one more question from our audience. Muriel wants to know why the slower growth in California. Does the 1 and 8 replacement not apply there?
Yeah, so California is an interesting story for Hispanics. We have seen in the last 10 years population growth for Hispanics slow substantially there because it turns out that California is not quite the destination for immigrants like it used to be. It's an expensive state, and we've also seen many Hispanics leave California for other states in the area like Nevada or Arizona or even Texas. And so California's Hispanic population, while substantial and still growing, is growing relatively slowly compared to other parts of the country. Another challenge is that it has a large base. It's just a large population of Hispanics. But to give you some sense of how quickly this has changed, back in 2008, the Department of Finance of the state of California was predicting that Hispanics would be the majority of the state's population by 2060. A few years later, they were saying they're not sure if the population of Hispanics was going to be the majority of the state's population by 2060. So they lowered their share of the population that's Hispanic, reflecting slowing immigration and reflecting some of the population and economic challenges that the state has faced.
All right, Devera, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chiki. Thank you, Mark. So I'll walk very quickly through some census FAQs. You already know the first one, and all of you got it right, I guess. I'm going to focus a little bit on the second one, which is people are counted where they live on April 1. And this is going to be a big problem this year. Now, why April 1? Well, because we want the census to be a snapshot of where everybody is at a single moment in time. But by April 1, the pandemic was really going. A lot of college students had been sent home. A lot of people had moved in with family to save money. A lot of young adults moved back in with their parents. So there was a lot of instability in the population. In fact, we did a survey, found that about 8 or 9% of Americans, adults, had either moved themselves or had someone move into their household. So there's a lot of turmoil going on, and people may not know where they should properly be counted. This could be a problem. many ways to respond, and online is being promoted this year. And then there are a lot of special operations that I'll get into in a little bit to count people who don't live in households but who might live in military barracks or transitory situations like RV camps and that sort of thing.
Devera, I'm just going to ask you to raise your microphone a little bit more because I'm having a hard time hearing you. That might help.
Okay.
I think that's better.
Is that louder?
That is
better?
Now. Thank you.
Okay. I'm a soft talker, so keep telling me to just raise my voice.
All right.
All right. So here we can see how the census was really affected by the pandemic. I have here a list of some of the key operations and the original dates and then the changed dates. And in fact, the Census Bureau just announced last night the end date for when they're going to stop counting, and that'll be at the end of September. Originally, they had said, well, originally it was going to be actually even earlier in the summer, and then they postponed it till the end of October. Well, now we're back to, we're going to be done by the end of September. And that means we'll be done knocking on doors, we'll be done having people send their own forms in, everything will be done.
Well, why the back and forth? Why, obviously, I know why they moved it to October, right? COVID happened, people were concerned, census, people can't knock on doors, but why is the administration now moving it up to September 30th? Have they given a reason?
Well, at one point they were asking for an extension of the legal deadline to release the data.
Okay.
So they wanted to be able to count for longer and then allow themselves the time that it takes to edit the data, get it into shape, weed out duplicate responses and that sort of thing. Now they're saying they've changed their mind about that. They want to be able to get the count out at the original time. This is somewhat controversial politically, but that's what's been announced. And they are going to get, it appears, some extra money from Congress to do that, to hire extra people to knock on doors. They're talking about even giving extra money to enumerators, that is census workers, who put in lots of hours. So they're really trying to get it going very quickly and fully to try to count all the people who want to be counted by the end of September. They postponed the homeless count. They originally were going to do it late March, early April. Now it's going to be in late September. Apparently they've gotten advice from groups that work with homeless people that late September and late March are kind of similar in terms of patterns of where folks without homes tend to be. So it's a complicated business to count everybody, and we'll just see how well they do. The census, to its credit, publishes a lot of data about the quality of the numbers that it collects, and so we'll have a good insight into how well they did when the Bureau publishes those numbers.
And do you have a sense of, like, I've been not in my permanent residence since March 15th. I've been in my vacation home. Are people going to get confused about, like, oh, I'm here now, you know, counting me in the right place at the right time? I mean, I obviously did it right, but is that causing confusion?
It is, and even in normal census years, there's confusion. For example, college students are supposed to be counted where they live and sleep most of the time, and that's the rule for everybody, and where they are as of April 1. Well, so if you're living in a dormitory or an off-campus house in the college town, that's where you're supposed to be counted, not at your parents' house, even though your parents may claim you on their taxes and pay your tuition and so forth. Similarly with vacation homes, if you live in your vacation home for 5 months and 20 days, and the rest of the year you live in your main house is where you're supposed to be counted, even if you're at your vacation home on April 1. So it's where you ordinarily live and sleep for most of the year, and that means 6 months and 1 day, if it comes to that. But there is a lot of confusion, as you say, and the Census Bureau is paddling like mad to try to get the word out. So next slide. There certainly has been a lot of concern that the pandemic and the delays in census operations will have a particular impact on historically undercounted groups. Now, what are those groups? The most obvious ones tend to be the Black and Latino populations, and to some extent young people, and oddly enough, young children younger than 5 is the most undercounted age group. And the pandemic has had a huge impact on the operations that the Census Bureau has been counting on to try to stir up enthusiasm. So there are fewer rallies and in-person events. Public computers, such as in libraries, were going to be made available for people to fill out their forms and to get assistance. A lot of those are closed up. There were call center waits for people who wanted to phone in their responses. Those may have gotten better, but those were especially problematic when they were occurring for people who don't speak English and wanted language assistance. There's the college student issue that I mentioned. And then there was a little bit of misinformation going around that somehow filling out your census form was linked to whether you got your stimulus payment. That isn't true. And fortunately, there has not been a lot of misinformation, but there was that. There are, however, I don't want to say some good things about the pandemic, but some things that haven't been as bad as feared. So the census has been promoting online response, including telling people, well, you're stuck at home, you might as well fill out your census form. And in fact, the online response has been higher than projected, and the website has managed to stay up and running throughout, although there had been some concern that it might go down. At the start of the census, we were in a historic low unemployment environment, and the Census Bureau was worried it would not be able to recruit many people or the workforce it needed to hire 500,000 people to go knock on doors. Well, that's changed, and there's some indication that the quality of job applicants, and certainly the number, may be going up, even though, of course, some of those applicants are very concerned about having to knock on doors in a coronavirus environment. They are being issued masks, told to stand outside 6 feet away from everybody and so forth, but there is a certain amount of fear. And I've got some survey results about that later on in this webinar. So the Bureau also has been pivoting a bit in its advertising and get out the count activities with some of the partner organizations to take advantage of reaching people at food banks and that sort of thing. And they're confident now that they'll get a good count of students who are living on campus because they've been working with colleges to do that, although they're still concerned about some of those students in off-campus housing.
What about students that were supposed to start moving in, right? This is the month where they move in to go to school, and their university has decided to go online through this next semester.
Well,
where are they going to get counted, or how are they being told what to do right?
Remember that it's April 1. That's the key date. So these students should already have been included in, yeah. But, you know, this brings up the issue of sometimes people don't always remember where they were living on April 1. Especially, well, all right, you know, an example, say you're living with your boyfriend or girlfriend, you know, you broke up. Well, when did you break up? Was it March 29th or April 4th? You know, that may be a small group, but in fact, research has shown that the closer in time to April 1 that people fill out their information or provide their information, the more accurate it is. So as we get longer or farther away from that date, the risk of inaccurate information grows.
Okay.
So this is from a survey that we took recently in June, and let me give you 2 takeaways from that. As you can see in the chart, the share of people who say they participated in the census differs by group, and among the historically undercounted groups, look at the Black adults and the Latino adults. Their numbers are lower in terms of participation than the white adults. Similarly, younger adults are less likely to say they filled out the census than older ones. Some of the younger ones, it may turn out, are living with other people who filled it out, so that may bring up their numbers, but it is a concern. In addition, we also asked people more recently, would you, if you haven't participated, would you answer the door if someone knocked? And although most would, 4 in 10 say they would not talk to a census worker. So
40%
of those who haven't, yeah. say that they...
This is a June survey, so do you think it has to do with resurgence of in certain parts of the country, or because I mean isn't that like one of the main ways to close the gap for the census, to knock on doors?
No, even in a normal year where everybody is, they're not worried about virus, the door knocking only gets a certain share of people. There's some people who just either can't be found, don't want to answer the census, don't know a lot about it. Our research has found that the more people know about the census, the more they are inclined to participate. And that's actually something I'll get to a little in my next slide. So when the census runs out of people that are willing to answer the door, the next step is it tries to find another source of information. So maybe a neighbor, or in the case of a renter, maybe a landlord could supply that information. Or it'll turn to statistical methods if it can't find any other way. It'll look at similar kinds of households and see what kind of people were living in those households, and we'll count folks in those unknown households that way.
But that's the most troubling part about the census.
Yes.
If when they just assign you a race and ethnicity based on who lives around you. That's
well,
poquito.
This year they do have another tool that they may be using, which is something called administrative records or government records. They've gotten records from more than a dozen other agencies, and they also have some third-party, some private records, commercial databases. And they're talking about being able to use those in addition to using their own records, earlier responses that you might have given to the census or to a census survey to try to count people. So there are some methods, innovative methods that they may be using this year to keep their data quality up. But yes, I agree. What you really want is people to supply their own information directly to the census. And if that doesn't happen, you're going to risk some inaccuracy.
Being misrepresented.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So this goes back to some of the questions we asked at the beginning of this webcast. What do people know about the census? And as I say, the more they know, usually the more inclined they are to participate. The two tend to go hand in hand, although it's not always a direct relationship. And notice how many people did not know that there is not a citizenship question on the census. There may be still people out there who don't know that because they haven't opened their census mailings or haven't looked at the forms they've gotten. And
just refresh us, Devera, on what happened. Mm-hmm. Sure. The administration was trying to get a question added to the census, but it failed, correct?
That's right.
Give us a little background.
That's right. The administration asked to include a question about the citizenship status of everybody who filled out the census. So are you a citizen, and if so, are you a naturalized citizen? So it would have gotten both birth and citizenship. Didn't ask legal status, that's important to know, but it would have asked citizenship. And that was overruled by the Supreme Court last year in July. And the administration said it didn't have enough time to put up a fight, and so it was just going to go with taking it off the census form, but it would try to collect the information by other means. And that's one reason why the Census Bureau is collecting all this data from other agencies. They're trying to assemble a database of everyone's citizenship status from other government records. This would be...
Mark, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, one of the interesting things here about the citizenship question, if you remember, there was a lot of news coverage about whether or not the census will have a citizenship question. That impacted people's knowledge, it seems, in some way. For example, if you look at a lot of foreign-born Hispanics, while they're more likely to know that the citizenship question wasn't going to be on the census, still the majority of them either were not sure or said yes, it would be on the census, with the biggest chunk being people saying among Hispanic immigrants that they weren't sure if it was going to be on the census or not. So the conversation may have had some impact on people's both knowledge about the census, and people started to think about this, and even though it didn't appear it could have had some impact on perhaps participation, but also could have had some impact on how much people know about what's actually
But
on the
Hispanics
census.
are one of those traditionally undercounted groups, and there's always been confusion about, regardless of the citizenship status, right? Why is that? I mean,
yeah, but yeah, it's one of the most interesting findings that we have had at the Pew Research Center, I think, with regards to Latinos, which is that when you talk about the nation's Hispanic population, turns out immigrant Hispanics are more likely to participate, also more likely to know details about the census. As I mentioned to you, they were a large part of the Hispanic immigrant population were not sure if the citizenship question was going to be on there. But that wasn't the case among U.S.-born Hispanics, who were more likely to say it was going to be on there, or to say no, they weren't necessarily in this unsure space. But it is interesting that the U.S.-born Hispanic has not necessarily known as much about the census and has maybe even indicated a lower likelihood of participating prior to the census than immigrant Hispanics, which may be counter to what people usually think. People think it is immigrant Hispanics who are going to be, particularly undocumented immigrant Hispanics, who are going to be undercounted. That's one of the findings that we had in both 2010, and we saw it again this year in the findings that Dee is sharing here about both knowledge but also participation.
One possible reason for that could be that there's a lot of outreach that's aimed directly at immigrants from groups that work with them. And so they may be getting more information than U.S.-born Hispanics about the census.
wonderful.
Okay, so this slide is not quite right, but things change so fast I didn't have time to update. There will not at this point be a delay in census numbers. That's important to say, that the Census Bureau says that it will meet the legal deadlines to put out the first two sets of numbers. So the first set of numbers that would be released is the count of how many seats each state gets in Congress. That's the so-called apportionment count. That will come out by the December 31st of this year. At first, the census had been talking. They had asked Congress, in fact, for an extension till April 30th, but they're pulling back on that now. Similarly, with the second set of numbers, there had been also talk of delaying those, but those also will not be delayed. So the next set of numbers that come out are the very detailed local level counts of by race, Hispanic origin, voting age or 18 plus, some information about occupancy status and group quarters, which are things like military barracks and college dormitories. And those numbers are furnished to states so that they can draw the political boundary lines within those states for everything from congressional districts to local school boards and so forth. Those numbers usually are rolled out on a state-by-state basis. Traditionally, they've been starting around February and then ending by April 1. And by the end of that time, we will have a complete picture of the racial and ethnic makeup of this country, as well as some rough idea of age, of older than 18 plus and younger than 18. Additionally, the next set of data after that, we don't have release dates for, but one of the nice ones that I know marketers will look forward to is what's called a demographic profile, which has not only the basic information about race, but we'll have gender, we'll have more detailed age breakdowns, and we'll have some relationship or household makeup in it. That's the kind of stuff that you really want to know, is how many households have kids or married couples or that sort of thing. And then there's also that citizenship status file that's being released separately from the census, but will have some information in it about the citizenship status of everybody in the U.S.
So I guess the question will be, how reliable is this data? But I think was that your last slide, Sarah?
No, we
can't
got two
remember.
more.
Oh,
what they're used
sorry
for
about
and
that.
What folks can learn. So how are census numbers used? I think we got a taste of that from that West Wing clip. And certainly for research purposes, as Mark said, it's very important. Marketers use it, and so do planners for locating either businesses, schools, and roads, and then all the political uses that have been mentioned, which are based basically on population change and which areas are growing and which aren't. Now, what will we learn from these numbers? Okay, so all of this is based on what we already know, and all of that could go kerflooey, of course, if the census numbers turn out differently from the kind of estimates we've gotten so far. And in all past censuses, there's always been at least one surprise or another, so stay tuned for that. But some of the big picture changes that we might be seeing, certainly slower population growth than we've seen in the past, interesting patterns of racial and ethnic growth and dispersion. We're also getting new information from the form about people's origins. For the first time, if you check white or black on the race side, you'll be asked for more information about your origins, and examples being Irish, Lebanese, Somali, and so forth. And that could provide a lot of really interesting data, assuming people participate in that. It's an optional thing. But in the past, when they've done studies on this, about half of those asked have provided that data. We'll learn something about average household size, which sounds kind of boring, but in fact is a crucial metric for the economy, because if household size gets bigger and it grows faster than the population, then there are fewer new households to purchase goods that traditionally are purchased when a new household is formed. So we've certainly been seeing a growth in multi-generational households. Certainly the pandemic may have accelerated that, and we'll see what the census shows. We already had a little bit of a taste of the idea of population aging. That's what's going on with the white population. And in the country as a whole, what we're seeing is that the older population is growing and the younger population is shrinking. That's playing out already in some states and may play out in more that we'll see with census data. We also, for the first time, have an explicit option on the census form for same-sex married couple or same-sex partner. So that'll be a bit of data for folks to work with. We'll also have home ownership rates, which is a good metric for economic vitality. And then, as I said, we'll have differing state population trends that will play out in the political arena. So this is a little promo for our 5-lesson mini course on the census. If you want to know more than what we've been able to do.
Which I took, and I thought it was fabulous. But I'm going to let Jake jump in here and go ahead, start us off with some questions, remind our audience that we're open for questions as well.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to ask some questions. I've had some spotty internet.
Okay. If we lose you, we'll just keep on going without you, sweetie.
So my first question to you is, please, listen, we've heard a lot about the census today, but I wanted to kind of shift the question back to the Pew. I've used your research probably for over a decade. And I believe that a lot of people in the corporate world are using your data. So can you speak to the methodological rigor that sort of speaks to the undercount and the places that are really hard to reach? And then secondly, I also want to hear from you on what advice can you give corporate America, corporations, when they're putting together research that reflects a multicultural America?
Great questions, Jake. So first, what is the Pew Research Center doing when it comes to publishing reports that use Census Bureau data or public opinion survey work that is based off of or weighted to the characteristics of the U.S. population, again, based off of Census Bureau data? Particularly for our estimates of, say, the undocumented immigrant population in the United States. And I'd say an estimate because we don't know the exact number of people who are in the country without authorization, but we can estimate that population using Census Bureau data. But in that case, we do make an adjustment for undercount. There's research from many different sources done over the last few decades that gives us at least some sense of how much undercount there might be of the undocumented population in the U.S. A lot of that is Hispanic. And so when we make that adjustment, our adjustment is a not a small adjustment, not a big one, but enough to change some of the results if you didn't make the adjustment. So this is something that we're sensitive to regularly. But in all honesty, in much of our work on Census Bureau, using Census Bureau data, like to characterize the nation's white population, we don't necessarily make population undercount adjustments all the time. We follow what the Census Bureau provides, and to some extent that's important to note because the Census Bureau is sensitive to this. They try to make fixes as well, but we don't want to be too far off from what the Census Bureau itself reports because folks will say, well, why does your number look so different from the Census Bureau's number, and why is that? So we try to follow closely what the Census Bureau does. But that's just a little bit about how we do things at the Pew Research Center. And I think there was a second question. I'm trying to remember the second question.
Marketing.
Yeah. What do you recommend to do, right, for corporate America?
So when we think about reporting on race and ethnicity, we oftentimes follow this particular set of protocols. We report out all the large racial and ethnic groups, so whites, blacks, and Asians, but only the non-Hispanic portions of those groups, and then the Hispanic population, so that there's no overlap. The groups are separate from each other. Sometimes you will also report the mixed race population and also the Native American population in the U.S. and some population statistics that we publish. Those, again, are also the non-Hispanic portions of those groups, and that leads to mutually exclusive categories for each group. Now, that sometimes isn't necessarily the best way to go when you're talking about, say, just the Asian American population alone. You want to capture everybody who says that they report some Asian American background, if that's the net that you want to cast. And we will indicate how we do this in our methodology so that you get some sense of who's included and who is not included when we classify or characterize a population. But we find that when you do public opinion work, one of the most important things to do is to let people tell you how they see themselves. So self-reporting their identity, which is the way the Census Bureau frankly works. People are self-reporting their own identity when they answer. But that's very important, and it's something that we take very much to heart, and it's key to how we do our public opinion data work. People tell us what they are, and that's how we report out the data.
Absolutely, the consumer is the best person to ask. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And so I think this conversation is particularly important because, going back to that first or two slides, as the country is changing demographically, the methodology and the rigor and the way that we sample is particularly important. And one of the things that I'm seeing in the marketplace is that we're lagging a little bit in this area. So I just wanted to put a little button on this point because I think this is an important learning for all of us. I shouldn't be asking you this question,
Jake,
but
if I could add one more thing.
Sure.
I was going to say, Jake, if I can add one more thing, which is that it's important to, when you do public opinion work, to pay attention to having Spanish surveys for Hispanics. That's a very important part of the story. And interestingly, Asian Americans, of course, there are many different languages, but much of the survey work that's done of that group doesn't include people who only speak those other languages. Sorry, I wanted to add that in there because that's important to get when you talk about multi-ethnic surveys.
This is a really important, not even detail, this is an important point because this is where the corners are cut in research because you're talking about feasibility. And so people overlook the feasibility issues that have a very much have a direct impact on the validity or the reliability of the work. So everything you're mentioning here is spot on. So you are a wealth of knowledge, Dee. Maybe this is for you to respond as well. But is there anything that surprised you along the way in your career at the Pew?
Well, I guess I'd like to say now I'm never surprised. I know so much, but I will say when you study about something or you read about something a lot, you can often assume everybody knows what you know. And I guess I was a bit struck by the low percentage of folks who knew that there was not a citizenship question on the form. There have been so much in the media about this, but the fact that many people didn't know indicates that I guess the amount of lifting that has to be done to get the word out about the census and what it asks or doesn't ask.
Well, I see a few people typing questions, and I just got one from Alan Irish. Asian as a racial category is a terrible construct. Most people conflate it with East Asia, but note that Israel, Syria, Turkey, and much of Russia are Asia and are not Asian in the sense that most people consider that category. Mark, you want to take that one?
Yeah, and this is a great question, because this is something that I think that whether one talks about the Hispanic population or even the Black population in the United States and the Asian American population, we have these terms that are meant to be these pan-ethnic characterizations of these groups. In the case of Asian Americans, there's tremendous diversity within that population. Even if you were to just focus on East Asia, there is a tremendous amount of diversity in language and experience and share foreign-born when people came to the country. And I think one of the important notes to think about is when you talk to the Asian American community, they oftentimes emphasize that, yes, on the one hand, we want to talk about it as a group to show our numbers as a group. But on the other hand, you need to disaggregate the story of Asian Americans, because it is different whether you're Hmong, Cambodian, Chinese, Japanese, or if you're Chinese that came 3 or 4 decades ago versus Chinese that's come more recently. The same can be said about Black Americans. There are foreign-born people in the United States who would classify themselves as Black, but they may not necessarily identify with the U.S. Black American experience. And even among U.S. born Black Americans, some are born in the South, some are born in the Northeast, some may be of a mixed race heritage. There's diversity in that population as well, something that oftentimes we don't think about. We have to just say the Black population is this. But that may miss a lot of nuances and characteristics, which is why what I've learned from my colleagues in the Asian American research community is the importance of disaggregation. It's something you just got to do if you can, because the story is so rich and you need to pay attention to that because it's quite a diverse set of experiences. Great question. Thank you for that, Alan.
And we have one from Christina H. Hello, and thank you for offering this webinar. COVID-19 appears to be causing significant numbers of people to move to new states and communities, to be with family, etc. How might this affect the validity of the census data, data that has already been collected? And then I'll have a final question. Because we're running out of time. How confident are you of the results that'll come out on December 31st? Let's start with Deborah.
Well, remember, people are supposed to be counted where they were on April 1 if that was their usual residence. So if they moved out even the next day to a new house, they were supposed to be counted where they were April 1. We'll see whether that happens. I mean, it's going to be complicated, and a lot of people may not know that.
And the pandemic really started mid-March, March 12, 13, 14.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
That's when people were like locked down. And how confident are you two about the validity of the results, given the COVID, given the pressure? We're going to delay, we're not going to delay. Give me a 80%, 70%, 30%, 90%.
I don't know if I could give you that, but I will say that this census effort this year is different from other ones. You could fill out the census, for example, online for the first time. So that's an important difference. And it does look like participation rates generally for the U.S. public have been at least as good as what we saw in 2010. So it looks like there's some good things going on with the census. And as Dee noted earlier, there haven't been the misinformation and challenges that some were expecting with the census, even in a COVID-19 world. However, with people moving and perhaps folks' lives upended in some way, there may be many people who would have participated who may not participate. That may be a challenge for what we can learn from the census. And if people are captured where they are on April 1st and they consider their new location that they've moved to, like Chiki, you consider your vacation home your new residence.
No, I live in New York.
And you say you're counting. If somebody were like you, but it was in a different state, that can help that state in terms of many different things and resources. and not necessarily the state that they may return to. So it depends how people answer the census. I do think, though, that we're going to have some really good information and new details about the U.S. population that we haven't had before. And every census, there is a chance to assess how good it was. And the Census Bureau, as Dee noted, will do some really good analysis to see where it fell short. So it remains to be seen what we'll find. But I'm excited about some of the new things that are going to be coming out.
Good. And on that note, we're really out of time, guys. It's past the hour. Some people are dropping off. I want to thank everybody. Ask them to tune in to what's going to be another great conversation on August 20th about fake news and how it's affecting marketing with a professor from MIT who is an expert on that, and my institute leader, JP Kuline. And then this Thursday, don't miss a conversation about consumption in the time of COVID and beyond with my colleagues from the Conference Board. And with that, I want to thank Mark and Devera and Jake. Always, we could have gone another hour. Thank you to our audience. We really, really appreciate it and hope to see you very soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.